Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is August 16th, 2018, and this is episode 99, the last of the double digits. Politicos is the BC Politics podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicos.
I'm Scott Boom.
I'm Ian Bushfield, and today we're joined by
Stewart Prest.
Welcome to my other podcast, Stewart.
Thanks.
We had so much fun on Canby Report. I figured we'd bring you over here and
I appreciate
talk more.
it.
We won't be talking about political axes today, probably, though.
Well, don't count it out.
Yeah, all right. What we will be talking about are fires, statues, and conservatives, and there's some link there. Pull it out as you will. First, as always, we'll thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, the daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free 2-week trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate for you. For your free 2-week trial, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. And speaking of BC Today, one of the co-hosts of our episode 100 live show is going to be BC Today's own reporter extraordinaire, Shannon Waters, who has appeared on the show once before, I believe. We're excited about that.
Very cool.
The show is going to be next Thursday, August 23rd at the Belmont. Doors open at 7 p.m. Get your tickets at politicos.eventbrite.com, or there's a link on the front page of our website or the show notes to this. We're on Facebook. Please RSVP so I'm not paranoid that we're going to, let the venue down and never get to have a nice event again. We're also trying to line up a second guest to interview. If you have ideas or suggestions, send them to us ASAP. But things are in the works. It should be a good time. But let's jump into our first segment, Smaugust. It's actually not as hazy out today. We can see the mountains again, which is nice.
First time in like a week.
Yeah, but I had this retweet on my Facebook page, or whatever you call it, a share of, I think it was Adam Olson or some other Green MLA's post just about the smoke that's coming into Vancouver on what seems like an annual basis now. And, he's just talking about the threats of climate change, and we can get into that. And I think my point was, this feels like we're almost getting a fifth season in BC, where the latter half of summer is just the smoky, hazy end where, you have your nice July and June, and then August and September are hard to breathe times.
Smoke season.
The political angle, though, this week, the BC government declared an official state of emergency. I think the fourth time in history. There was some debate about the facts on that, but all four of those have been due to forest fires, and they seem to be getting more frequent.
Considering the third one was last year, it does seem like that's a bit, twice perhaps not a trend, but then again.
Yeah, and I think the time before that was like 2003 or something.
Right.
So
definitely more
within
frequent.
the last couple decades, we've done most of them.
There's lots of stats on this, and one of the ones that stuck out in my mind was something like 5 of the top forest fire seasons have been the last 5 years. It's not necessarily the top 5, I don't remember, but the last 5 years have not been good. This year, it sounds like there are more fires, but they're smaller than last year, which last year I think we all recall was a pretty bad year for forest fires and towns being evacuated. I guess the optimistic angle here is what I not like, but what I can appreciate of this is these kind of crises actually transcend partisanship to the point where everyone kind of sets aside their typical bitterness and can get along. Like the BC government and federal government can go, hey, we need to solve this. Let's forget for a second about pipeline spats and all this other stuff and just put firefighters on the ground where they're needed.
Yeah, it does generally bring people together, at least in the short term. And in the slightly longer term, I'm sure the opposition will find something to nitpick about.
It's a pretty good example, though, of how we talk about federalism in Canada like it's an increasingly challenging thing where it's hard to get anything done in this country. The pipelines come to mind. But this is a sort of an episode which reminds us that, in a lot of ways, federalism works really well. So well that we barely notice it. There's emergency crews needed in BC. Earlier in the year, they were needed elsewhere, and BC crews were working somewhere else in the country. And that is done about as seamlessly as you can hope. We can talk about whether there's enough resources in total to fight fires across the country and in the province, but the backbone of federalism, the sort of sinews that you don't really think about. We think about the clashes, the first ministers' meetings, but the things that are always working behind the scenes are generally always working.
Yeah, and the federal government agreed to deploy the army within a couple hours of the province asking. Yeah, stuff like that. That does work fairly well.
Well, and at one of the last Canby Report live shows, we had Gordon Price talking about, what is the most important thing a city does? And everyone kind of scratched their heads for a minute, and he said water. And no one thinks about it because it's done right and well, for the most part. I mean, you're an engineer, so you think about it all the time. But for the average person, they don't think about going into the ballot box. Which one of these politicians will manage our wells well?
Right. We don't actually have wells.
No, I know. The joke needs to work that way.
Right. But the reason they don't think about it is because it works most of the time. And when we talk about it, we talk about the bits that aren't working.
Yeah, like the beaches that are closed because in part we don't have a great sewer system.
Right. Highly visible things that don't work.
One of the things, though, that has come out as a criticism of the NDP government and its response this year was how it seemed like they were more unprepared. Back in the budget, they set aside something like $40 million for fire responses this year. And last year we spent something on the order of 700,000, I want to say, 700 million or more. And this year we're already up into the 500, 600 million dollar range.
And I believe when the budget was announced, it got a little play. I mean, it was mostly swamped by the housing and everything else that was in the budget. But I think a couple people did note that it seemed a little light considering we just gone through a big fire season.
I think the defense at the time was there's this surplus cushion that can absorb some of that overrun, but it's not a great look to be off in your projection by that much.
So the story, as I understand it, is when they set that budget out, they need a planning process. They need some sort of benchmark. They've been looking over a longer period of time, and this is where we run right into that question: is are things getting worse? So if the worst season on record is last year, and the second, third, whatever the 2003 was within less than 2 decades ago, and that we see more intense fires more often, then the question is, do we need to revisit that benchmark? First of all, is 10 years the appropriate amount of time to be thinking? Do we need to update a little more often? And if there's 1 year where we over budget, maybe that's not the worst thing in the world. And then there's this other question, which is still debated, and yet it seems like there's a lot of evidence. What's driving the change? And there's probably, like every complex system, there's going to be a number of causes, but the one that looms large is climate change that we want to talk about.
Yeah, I know a couple biologists who actually work on some tangential aspects to it, and it's not as simple as the earth is hotter and fire is hot too, so BC is more on fire because the planet is hotter. But it can be little things like our winters don't get as cold as they used to, so things like the mountain pine beetle can spread further north, devastating forests, which leaves them tinder dry. So when a fire comes along, it can just spread through a larger area than it might have before all of those trees had been killed off. And all of these sort of compounding effects. It's kind of like when bad hurricanes hit the US. You can't go, well, that hurricane was obviously caused by climate change. The stats don't work like that. It's hard to make that causal connection. But when you see hurricane after hurricane and you see more and more fires and hotter, it starts to build up that trend line that becomes a bit harder to deny.
Right.
And the climate change stuff is going to be more important. It does influence that return period that all of these assumptions are based on. And I'm not sure exactly how they do it with fires, but when it comes to stormwater, you basically just take the history of it, do a little bit of stats on it, and you pull out all what your return periods are, what you can expect, how frequently you're going to get big events, and I presume fires probably work the same way. And yet, even in my undergrad classes, we were talking about how, no, that's probably not going to work going forward, and the forest probably has the same thing going on, and we do need to revisit those assumptions.
I think it's something we're going to talk about. We've been talking about it in a sort of theoretical way for a while, but this idea that climate change and that there are going to be systems that work unpredictably but work differently than before. And we have to be alive to possibility that what the long trend line is not going to be as predictive as it once was. And one of those outcomes might be that there are more forest fires more often, and we'll have more monster wildfire seasons in BC, simply not because it's a one-to-one Earth getting hotter, more fires connection, but simply because there might be more intense periods of drought. Maybe the rain comes more quickly, longer dry seasons, longer summers, some sort of, like you're saying, a net set of circumstances. We just not necessarily going to say that every year is going to be worse, but there's going to be more variance. And that alone is a reason to have to revisit your planning. You might need to be prepared for more outlier events.
Seems like a good reason as well to maybe try to shift our economy more off of fossil fuels and support more efforts to price carbon at the exact time when a lot of governments seem to be wanting to do the opposite in this country. But, policy and politics are always going to have their issues.
Yeah, it is interesting. These conversations don't always line up in the way you think they might. We have a hermetically sealed conversation about energy politics, and then another one about the environment, and some make that connection, and others really want to treat them as distinct entities even now, and that makes it hard to come up with a coherent, comprehensive policy. And of course, there's other issues. It's not just climate change, and I think seeing some of the discussion online, it seems like some people really want to push back against the idea that it's all climate change. It's not. There are other factors at play too, and there are some things that government probably can do to prepare us, not today, not this month, but in terms of approaching things like forestry management differently. So that's something where, and here I'm skating way over, sort of here's a line of my expertise, and then I'm going to take a big jump beyond my expertise, but some programs that exist now, like Fire Smart, trying to create communities that are more ready for the possibility of wildfires, and that are sort of designed and consciously try to reduce the possibility of burns by reducing foliage close to buildings, that kind of thing. That's the sort of thing we can do, and even longer term management strategies.
Well, one of the things that I've heard, and if I'm wrong, we'll get fact checked on Twitter as usual, but for a long time, the approach to fire management was less sort of strategic in recognizing the actual importance of forest fires in sort of the natural cycles of the ecosystem, and just the let's stop them all before they get out of control. And this is the sort of probably the 1950s to 80s kind of approach, and that led to increasing dry material decomposing stuff that needed to burn, and letting that kind of spread all over left us in a situation where you can get out of control fires. And then we sort of realized that was bad and switched to a more controlled burn or some smaller felling or whatever to try to make sure that when fires do happen, they are more healthy, maybe, as it were. But
nicer fires.
Yeah. Any firefighters listening should definitely hit us up and tell us some stories from, flying around and water bombing the province.
Right, but not in the Martin Mars.
Moving on to segment 2, John A. comes tumbling down. The city of Victoria announced they were going to take down their statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, and then promptly did it.
Yeah. It's interesting to see the debate play out in fast forward, essentially, in the city of Victoria. A lot of places in the US, people know, over the last couple of years have debated Confederate monuments and all these kind of things, and Canada had its sort of not just Me Too approach, but look back at our historical figures and the names we've given buildings and the monuments we've erected over the years, and started to have a reconsideration of, what is the actual legacy of someone like Langevin, who, we named the Privy Council office building after, until we went, oh wait, he actually was the architect of the residential school system, among other things, and maybe that's not something to celebrate. And John A. Macdonald has a complicated history to be charitable. And this all seemed to play out in the span of like 24 hours in Victoria, which was interesting. And the fallout from it is probably going to sort of ripple for a couple months up until the election.
Yeah, they basically announced that the next council meeting had a vote on it, and pretty much immediately after the statue came down, I think, or within a few days.
Yeah, the statue, I think, went down last weekend. They'd already put up a plaque saying...
It's complicated.
Yeah, Within a couple of hours of the plaque going up, it got defaced with someone carving an X through it, and city saying, well, we'll just keep putting up plaques that say the same thing if you keep wrecking them. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the sort of statue cultural debates, Stuart?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. We used to say that Canada follows American politics about 10 years behind. Everything that happens there happens here in 10 years. Now, I mean,
Like
it's
10 weeks.
I know, it's the internet age, and we're just picking things up. So this idea of the quick removal of statues is something that has started to happen in the U.S. It was places like Baltimore I think it was last year. Can't remember if it was just before Charlottesville or after, but right around that time, places like Baltimore started to pull out statues in the middle of the night, and then the debate happens about, well, was that a good idea or not? And so now that this is the first time we've seen something quite like that here in Canada, but it does have that sort of precedent, and I guess it depends on what kind of discussion you want to have. The discussion, if you have it before the statue comes out, you have this sort of focal point for possible protest, counter-protest, and the idea of doing it ahead of time, I think, is just to try to head off that kind of charged atmosphere. And now people are going to talk about the ramifications, and you can talk about what should happen next time. But it does sort of remove that possibility of a flashpoint. So there's that sort of immediate thinking, but then there's this larger question about, well, what are statues for? And that's kind of at the heart of the two sides of the debate. Are statues, are they history, or are they celebrating our past? Is it documenting, or is it uplifting, or is it both, or is it something else? And I think you can make arguments on either side, but I think you also have to think about how the statues themselves are going to be perceived differently by different audiences.
Yeah, the criticism of a John A. Macdonald statue relates to his darker legacies of racism, of anti-immigrant sentiments, of the programs he put in place against Indigenous people and tried to eradicate them, at the same time as he was the first Prime Minister of Canada and who built a railroad across the country. I mean, that railroad was also built on the backs of underpaid Chinese laborers who then weren't given citizenship. So it's complicated at the very least. I mean, adding to this complexity is the fact that Victoria, like every city in BC, is going into an election soon, and the mayor, Lisa Helps, who brought this forward, was narrowly elected last time, and getting re-elected in municipalities isn't hard. You usually have a strong incumbency factor, but getting attention is. But kick off a culture war, and everyone across the country is talking about you, so much so that the government of Ontario stepped in kindly and offered to take this unwanted statue off the city of Victoria's hands.
And Victoria did not take them up on that offer.
I'm just trying to picture, like, who's paying for that shipment. Like, there was
I have
actually
a feeling Doug Ford would have been
Yeah.
willing to pick up the check for that one.
there was actually quite the impressive photo on CBC of the statue after it had been taken down, and it was on the back of a flatbed truck, like wrapped in styrofoam or something, and just like tied down. It was kind of a, like, you know, in those dictatorships when they like bring down the Saddam Hussein statue or something, like it looked like that, but it was John A. And so a part of it made me a little bit gleeful, just the like imagery of bringing down the statue, even though it's still like a nuanced thing. I mean, one of the defenses people try to make of the John A. criticism or the racism is, you know, it was a different time. But one of the things I found really informative in this past week is Twitter has been really good at, I've seen a couple threads of people pulling out, and historians pulling out, people who were calling John A. Macdonald racist when he was being racist. Like, it's
He
not
wasn't
that,
exactly in the center of the Overton window, even at the time.
yeah, it's not that he wasn't, you know, everyone was racist then. It's he was racist even then. And maybe more people, it was more socially acceptable, but there was definitely a lot of people who recognized he went pretty far in what he was trying to do. And I guess one of the advantages of these debates, whatever side you fall on, is at least we can hopefully get to learn some things like that and put them in. Like, people talk more about these historical figures when statues come down than when they stay.
I admittedly only learned who Langevin was when they were renaming the block.
Yeah, me too.
Although have they actually renamed it yet, or have they just
It's
taken off?
the name is the Privy Council Office and Prime Minister's
That's a
Office.
little boring.
Oh yeah, it's a terrible name.
Very functional.
other aspect of this sort of approach to reconciliation that's happening is the federal government this week also announced that they are in conversations with Indigenous leaders about creating a new statutory holiday as a sort of day of reconciliation. And that would either probably fall on Indigenous Peoples Day or at the end of September. And
Yeah, so that would be June. That would either be June 21st or September 30th.
And the September 30th would match up with Orange Shirt Day, which commemorates a specific case of a person running away from a residential school. This comes out of one of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Trudeau promised in his campaign to fulfill all of them. And there's the simple part of me that's just like, yay, another day off is always good. But
And that's what I kind of wonder if that will happen here. Is it going to be more like BC Day, or is it going to be more like Remembrance Day? And
of course, Remembrance Day for some is not even what
Yeah.
it once was. So,
But I have a feeling it's probably going to end up closer to the former. And I think part of that is, it's summer or early fall. The weather's going to be nice. And part of it, too, is I think what gives Remembrance Day a lot of its punch is everybody kind of had family members, or I think the average Canadian is more likely to have someone in their network that has served at one point than was a victim of the residential school. So I'm wondering if it just ends up being, you'll have Indigenous leaders, politicians, there'll be a ceremony, but the general public will just take it as a day to go to the beach.
So, this is the challenge of truth and reconciliation. At what point does the broader Canadian population do something about it? And how do you get them to do something about it? So the advantage of having a day is it's highly visible, and you can program around it. You can make sure that every year people are confronted with that, however, on the edges of their own existence. But at least it gives a platform that you can build off. And I think I don't have a good answer for how do you get people to do the work, but it clearly needs to be done for it to be more than just an empty phrase. You get the sense again and again every time we have a report. It's like we can brush the dust off our hands. We've finished that, and now we can move on to the next thing. But of course, that's not it at all. We've sort of set the table for now. We can actually do the real work of reconciliation. We have a measure of truth now, but we need to figure out how are we as a society going to confront those truths. It's probably true that there are very few people, comparatively speaking, who have someone in their circle who were victims of residential schools. There's going to be a lot of people out there who have people who were working at residential schools in their circles as well. And that doesn't mean that there's an individual level of guilt. You don't have to necessarily go right there, but you do have to acknowledge that the society that we take pride in also has this very dark history, and we need to find some way to get involved, put our shoulder to the wheel a little bit, and having a day where we're going to talk about it, where it'll be programming on CBC radio. It won't necessarily be everywhere in the country. People probably will go to the beach, but it gives us this opportunity and maybe something to build off. Beyond that, we need to have other ideas.
I know over the last couple years, I've attended one or two of the Indigenous Peoples Day celebrations events here in Vancouver, and I found those to be really worthwhile, and they've been growing, I think. And so the next logical step is to make it like an official day. And I guess it's probably been proclaimed by all of the levels of government that proclaim everything whenever they're asked, kind of thing. This idea of, a national holiday or national statutory holiday, I'm supportive of it. One of the things that it turns out is actually interesting about the way the federalism works is to really work, all of the provinces then need to pass an enabling legislation to make it a day off in their province. And then could we see Ontario say, no, we're not passing this, but because they don't care or don't want to do something just symbolic, but then they're not giving people a day off. I suspect it probably won't be an issue if the federal government says, hey, give everyone one more day off, and most provinces will probably be like, yeah, it's fine. Although we did have the whole debate about BC's Family Day not lining up with everyone else. Although there was never a federal Family Day.
No.
Yeah, but Bid Ski Hill probably is going to try and step in on this one.
Yeah, they'd be really... Well, maybe Glacier Resort will.
So the story of Family Day is an interesting one, how it spread as well. Subject for another podcast, I guess.
Well, I think that covers the first two. Let's move on to our third and probably main segment of the day. Whither the Conservatives? What the fuck is going on in the Conservative Party of Canada? Because this has not been a good week for them again.
That's a good question.
So I guess it started again with Maxime Bernier going on Twitter rants over the weekend, and that has led to a renewed call for him to be kicked out of caucus, a statement from Andrew Scheer saying he serves no official role in caucus, which is an interesting turn of phrase, and then Michelle Rempel, unrelated to all of this, going off on her own Twitter rant about illegal border crossings and ending and an attack on the media and ending a tweet with the word sad, period. I don't know where we want to start. Scott?
It's been a bad week for them.
Yeah. So Bernier's first Twitter thread was all about
It started
diversity and political correctness and identity politics and how he doesn't like these things.
Yeah, it started off as an attack on Trudeau for, one of Trudeau's, diversity is our strength platitudes, and then kind of spiraled out from there, and ending with more diversity will not be our strength. It will destroy what has made us such a great country. So,
well, and it's a thread where he also complained about people moving into their ghettos in the same thing when he talked about racial diversity, which is like on the edge of problematic to very. And then he also talked about people who live among us who reject basic Western values, lead to cultural balkanization. And, it gets called in soft and hard ways as coded racism and all of this kind of, what is he going for? And then Scheer faces, a week of attempts to try to get him to say something, and he finally goes, I personally disagree with the politicians on the left and right when they use identity politics to divide Canadians. I will not engage in this type of politics. But also Maxime Bernier holds no official role in caucus and does not speak for the Conservative Party of Canada on any issue. And it's like, why keep him around at this point?
Well, so there's so many layers here, right? There's personality. I mean, this is in the wake of a very hard-fought leadership campaign where Bernier lost by a slim margin, and he probably thought he had it going in.
And in fact, based on some of the stuff he said since, kind of feels it was stolen from him by the dairy farmers.
According to the, was it depublished book?
The censored one.
Yeah,
that he then released.
The pulled back, yeah. So he's definitely floated that idea that there was chicanery going on that took him out of the leadership, and he clearly doesn't have a lot of time for what Scheer thinks. There, I mean, he's even after the initial set of tweets, he sent another round of criticisms that just, this is not something you expect in a sort of leader-driven party like we've become accustomed to in Canada.
Well, the Conservative Party of Canada is all about free speech now.
There is that. So there's free speech, and then there's even the idea that politics is a team sport, and if you're scoring goals on your own team, it's difficult for the party as a whole to move ahead. So it's out of keeping with what we've become accustomed to with how our politicians behave. I suppose in that sense, it's actually kind of refreshing to see. We have MPs speaking their minds, even if it's not espousing things that I agree with. Yay openness, but it's clearly there's a lot more than that. And so there's this personal level, right? There's a grudge between Scheer and Bernier, but then there's there's a much deeper thing going on here as well, with the sort of struggle over what does the Conservative Party really think about immigration, about a diverse Canada.
Well, and that's where I think Michelle Rempel's Twitter thread is informative, because she's the shadow critic for immigration.
Citizenship and immigration, yeah.
She's not facing censure for the statement she's making. She's not really, Scheer's not going to kick her out. So that suggests to me either Scheer has no control over his caucus, and not cabinet, but shadow cabinet, or these are sort of the policy planks that they're agreeing upon and see that perhaps their polling suggests there's some movement that they can beat the Liberals on.
So there's another possibility as well, which is just that caucus itself. The Conservative caucus is divided. So Scheer has a lot of power as leader. He is not all powerful. He needs ultimately to bring his caucus along, especially if he's going to do something drastic like kick a member out of caucus. So if for all we know, he's seething behind the scenes and doesn't have the votes in caucus to move Bernier out. Bernier has support. We know he has support in the party. And so there may be a lot of people quietly nodding along with the points that he's making. I've seen a few columnists online actually saying, well, why isn't he not backing Bernier's position? And so this party is just stuck on the horns of this dilemma. Are you going to embrace this long history? Well, I mean, we have evidence that Canada's not always been open to diversity, but in the last 40 years or so, it's been this consciously cultivated idea and set of policies that Canada is a multicultural place. And the Conservatives have broadly been supportive of that.
And I should give credit to Scheer. In his statement, he talks about the Conservatives support a diverse Canada.
Right.
Support, welcoming people of all backgrounds and all of that.
And in practice, the Conservatives have been doing that for a long time, but there's always been that segment within the party that hasn't always felt happy going along with that.
That was actually my favorite part of Bernier's tweet. Is his first one criticizes identity politics as people who go after people based on their, religion, gender, a specific, demographic. But that's what Jason Kenney's job was under Stephen Harper, was to seek out immigrant communities and say, your values are conservative values, vote for us. And it worked.
Oh, yeah.
Because
it was
a lot of
stunningly successful in the 2011 election.
And then they decided to abandon that and burn all those bridges because their base their traditional base, their old stock base, as it were, got a little uneasy maybe about the changes.
Yeah, I don't think Canada's immune to the larger trends we're seeing in democracies around the world. This idea that is democracy, are they really open for everyone, or do we need to draw these lines that he's trying to draw? That there's some sort of core concept of Canadian identity. It's the same language we heard from was it Kelly Leach's campaign. That there's a core identity and that we should be able to draw a line beyond which people need to sort of move into the fold. And that's just not... So this idea Canada has a core identity that we're going to start to draw boundaries. If you don't fit within these categories, you're going to have to move towards that core identity. That is at odds with the way Canada has operated quite successfully for the last 40 years. It's the idea that to be Canadian is to want to be Canadian. You stand in the right lines, you acquire citizenship, and you subscribe to broadly liberal values, the same sort that you would find in any consolidated democracy. And beyond that, the slate is pretty clean. You can there's no end to the ways to invent to be Canadian and be hyphenated Canadian, and that's cool. We get videos of what was that, the Bangra
Halifax street sweepers.
Yeah. So Canada works really well with having this multiplicity of ways to be Canadian, to be a hyphenated Canadian. And we share values. It's not to say there is no Canadian identity, but it's really broad and inclusive, and it has to do subscribing to broadly liberal democratic values. And beyond that, you get to sort of find your own way. And most people, they stay here for a generation or two. Families acquire more and more of the sort of the sensibilities of Canada. Kids are more likely to play hockey and so on and so forth. But there's no necessary requirement, and that has been a pretty unique experiment in the world, one that has worked quite well. And so now this is a change. So it's important to say this is a change from what we have been doing for the last 40 years.
And I think the broader global climate right now is definitely playing into this, and it's helping bring some of those long dormant divisions within the party up to the forefront.
I think that's quite true. You see the same debates happening that Bernier's feeding into. I mean, obviously the U.S. and the Republican Party and Trump, but also in pretty much every country in Europe, there's a version of this debate happening. So we should be surprised in some ways that it hasn't come more loudly to Canada. That it was inevitable that it would show up in Canada in some regard.
Well, just before we pivot from there, I did read a really good long-form essay by Stephen Marsh, and I want to say Open Canada, on multiculturalism and like the inherent contradictions within, but how Canada is like struggling through. And, it was a mostly optimistic, well, also somewhat pragmatic and realistic, like there are still a lot of issues and it's challenging and it's not a done project. And I'll put that link in the show notes, but it is interesting to see how successful that has been. And like, I have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms up on my wall there, and in that was stuck this idea that Canada is a multicultural country and we should interpret everything within that. And Canada's like the only country where that's become a consensus. There are other countries that have tried multiculturalism, Britain, a lot of the other Commonwealth ones, but they've not like stuck with it in the same way. Some because I think they had a dominant culture for so long, but Canada's history is so bicultural between the English and the French. There was always this tension of, well, we just have to get along. And when I say English and French, obviously there are Indigenous people too, but neither of them really cared.
Right.
But one of the things that maybe can give us some insight into where those tensions and battle lines are being drawn and pushed for within the Conservative Party itself is this beautiful list of motions that has come out in advance of the Conservative Party of Canada's convention that's coming up next week. Before we start talking about how crazy this document is, I think it's worth caveating that every party's policy document is provisional. They tend to represent what the members really want, but the leadership knows is not a good idea. The NDP tends to have some pretty radical left things. The Liberals go all over the place. And
I'm now that we'll have done this, I'm sure when the NDP one comes up,
I think it was in the spring actually.
Yeah,
but
and that's how it happens, because we're going to keep doing the podcast for a long time. When that comes up, we'll go through that and poke fun at all the ridiculous ideas the NDP members have.
So what's in the Conservative Party? I know you looked through this pretty thoroughly, Scott, and highlighted a whole bunch of things that I think you like, are confused by, and fear. To just like pick 3 random categories.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the stuff was fairly typical conservative stuff, some of which I'm surprised wasn't in there already. The one thing on firearms was, we don't want law-abiding gun owners to become criminals because of a paperwork error, which is basically been the conservative position forever. So, like, okay, it's in there. I'm surprised they need to be said among this group, but so it is. And then it ranged all the way over to just some nutty stuff like ending birthright citizenship or moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem because, that isn't enough of a
I mean, if you're going to be pro-Israel as a party, you may as well go to 11.
Yeah, and that one, by the way, is from our local Vancouver Centre EDA. Probably need to put that one forward.
I mean, to their credit, they put forward this nice ABCs of competition one, which is actually pretty well branded. It's about making sure there's competition in airlines, banking, and cell phones. And those are actually issues the NDP has raised as issues because I think everyone in Canada hates all 3 of those industries.
Yes, and they definitely win best branding of any of this for that ABCs of competition. Right. And I know it's something that EDA in particular has been pushing for a long time.
And I mean, those are, not only are they hated industries, they are industries where there are only a few major players in Canada.
Unfortunately, they don't really say how they're going to fix it other than more competition, which is a nice tagline, but that's hard to do in industries that tend to self-monopolize.
Well, and in banking, there's a problem when you have too much competition in banking as well. You want to have a certain stability in the industry. And so that's not to say more competition wouldn't be useful, particularly, well, I mean, you can make an argument for all 3 of these, but going about how to do it, can you even get there for airlines? That's a big question. There are only so many flights in Canada per year, and like you say, the industry tends to self-monopolize.
Yeah, and part of it with all 3 of those is they do have restrictions on ownership that most other industries in Canada do not. So that could potentially be one way to approach it, but that isn't actually specified in here.
Well, and that raises another interesting proposal in there that was sort of in contradiction almost to all of these pro-free market ones. There was the sort of end foreign ownership in Canada of corporations.
It was
not of corporations generally, but
it was motion by Abbotsford that was to recognize that there's vital national security and, more interestingly, economic interests in maintaining Canadian ownership of these. And I can see the national security argument for telecoms, for example. I still think on the balance we'd be better off if we allowed non-Canadian owned telecoms to be in the market here. But, there's at least an argument on that one It's the economic interest that is oddly protectionist for the Party of Free Trade.
Well, it's about free Canadian trade. You know, as long as it's a Canadian company, they can be as free as they want.
This is the party that did bring in free trade to Canada, basically. So,
And then, before we move away from maybe the economic things, I think the thing we're probably in agreement on is this idea of a CANS UK, Canadian, New Zealand, and UK, and Australia, right?
yes. So, this
Free
is...
trade agreement.
Yeah,
And movement.
Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Basically, the idea would be to create a free trade, free movement of people zone. So, you could...
Sort of an EU of...
Not
quite, but like...
like a Schengen area
Right.
of like a fraction of the Commonwealth would basically be it.
Despite no shared borders.
Getting the band back together.
And interestingly, they also make mention of security cooperation, which...
Aren't we already doing?
Yeah, anyone who knows even like a minimum about the security cooperation recognizes that if you add the US in there, you get the Five Eyes.
Yeah, so
There's a lot of it.
a quiet dig against the U.S., I suppose you could read it as. But, I mean, a lot of this is being done in different ways, but not in the sort of drawing a circle around these specific countries. So it is an interesting bit of a throwback to the Commonwealth.
Well, there's a number of groups that are advocating, or maybe there's just one vocal group that's been advocating this for a while, this sort of alliance.
Yeah, and I know one of the main organizers of that group happens to live in Vancouver, which is probably why you're seeing Vancouver Centre pushing this one. And yeah, there's definitely a smallish movement to see it happen, and there's some good arguments for it, like free movement of people tends to actually result in a more efficient labor market, which actually benefits everyone because people are more productive when they can move to more productive places.
Oh yeah, that's, I think, the thing I'm coming around to more in my thinking is if we're going to talk about free trade, we need to also make sure people are as free as capital.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a solid point to open borders. So yeah, that one's definitely interesting. Probably not going to go anywhere, although it did get a little attention in the leadership race too, with Aaron O'Toole pushing for it as well. So like, it's an idea that's slowly making its way into the conservative thought.
Well, one idea that's not going anywhere on this policy list because it's ranked last in its section is the let's get rid of supply management motion.
Come out of the bows? Or who put it forward?
That was Carleton as well as Red Deer Lacombe.
It's actually interesting it's not Bernier's riding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You would think.
Although his riding is very agricultural. Like, he actually has a number of, I think,
Dairy farmers
in his own riding. Like, he lost his riding in his leadership.
Which is interesting because there's only like 10 ridings that have a lot of dairy farmers in them.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why we should stop being so afraid of getting rid of it, because the government's not, like, maybe will have half those seats going into it anyway, and like it's not going to make or break the government.
I always wonder what happens in the first meeting where you're a new MP on the Hill and you're all ready to break down supply management and the door closes behind the dairy guy and they walk out shaking and like, oh, we got to keep some, like, what do they say? It's like it's just such a stranglehold. And I mean, I understand that these are strategic ridings, they're competitive ridings, some of them. They are, and dairy is wildly popular. The industry has done a very good job of selling people on the idea that local dairy is good and that the quota system is the natural way to protect it. So it's hard to convince people otherwise when they see their own livelihoods bound up in it, as people in these ridings do.
And a little bit of false information about how it's also keeping our dairy safe hasn't hurt the cause of supply management either. But yeah, like we said, that's probably not going to go anywhere, unfortunately, and especially with Andrew Scheer leading the party right now. I can't imagine he'd be thrilled about the prospect of one of his signature issues.
Oh, what a twist would that be?
Well, and it's worth sort of pausing to like break down how conventions actually work. Because I think we've probably talked about it once or twice, but it's something that gets forgotten or not paid attention to by most people. And each party is a little bit different, but in general, you have your electoral district association, your constituency riding group of party people in every riding across the country. And within there, they are allowed to submit ideas and policies that party should adopt. And if they get enough support, they appear on the program, but that doesn't mean they get voted on, because they could have 300 ideas pitched to them. But the realities of political conference organizing and the fact the party doesn't want to get embarrassed by all the wingnuts they have, whether they're on the left or the right, means they try to rank the ones that represent the direction they want to go above the others. And those happen in small meetings that are more and less democratic depending on the party and the year and the leader. I know in the NDP's last one, there was like a big effort to try to get activists into those meetings on the day of to rank certain things higher, and they were partially successful in getting a like slightly more critical of Israel policy in than had ever been discussed in the NDP in the last 10 years. But in this case, it seems like the Conservative Party sort of did a regional ranking where I don't know the exact details, but I'm assuming it's sort of party insiders got to go, we're going to prioritize these 6 to 7, and if we have time, we'll get to the 26th thing in this section, which is supply management, which they won't. And so it's easy to bury them on the order paper, as it were.
So conventions are interesting, that there's a lot of diversity in how they happen. They're little laboratories of democracy. And I mean, sometimes not super democratic, like you're saying, that there's arm twisting and there's a role for insiders. But the way in which the votes happen, parties get to experiment and do different things. The way they choose their leaders, the way leadership contests happen. This is where we get a lot of the experimentation in Canada about how do different electoral processes work out. And they're interesting, vibrant, sort of weird places where stuff gets debated. And then, I mean, there's beyond what we're talking about here in terms of whether it actually makes it into policy, there's several additional layers of insulation, right? The party has to get elected, the party has to put together a throne speech, and then they have to find the resources and they have to prioritize. So it's a very long road from the convention floor to actual policy, but it's where parties do have to confront their own members and to hash things out of it.
Yeah, it's worth noting this might not. Some of these might not even make it into the platform, even if they pass the convention.
Yeah, I think
here.
At every layer, at every stage, there are these choices made.
So,
Every party, I think, in Canada at this point, except maybe the Greens, but we'll leave them out because they're a special case of trying to be too democratic by half. But there's advantages to that. They've all kind of retained this right to totally disregard the policy documents that are put together by the members when they construct platforms for elections and throne speeches. Now, those parties do have to go back to their members and they could face a revolt, but those are less and less frequent than I think they used to be.
They are until they aren't.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the story of the Reform Party, it emerges out of a massive revolt of prairie folk basically getting sick and tired of hearing about Ontario-Quebec politics, among other things. But then eventually seeing their issues constantly pushed to the side until they said they're sick and tired of it, except they've said it with a Preston Manning sounding voice, right? Which I'm not going to do. But
Reform!
Yeah. So when you have parties that really ignore the base for long enough, then you do get fireworks. But for the most part, this is more like a safety valve almost. It allows membership to let off steam, and it also allows the party to hear where the people are at.
Well, one thing that seemed to make it forward a little bit more than supply management, for example, is some of the social issues. In one of the sections, a relatively anti-choice motion actually made it to second on the list, which means it's very likely, it's actually unlikely it won't make it to the floor, as it were. This motion, unsurprisingly, comes from Brad Trost and would be about sort of...
Brad Trost riding.
Brad Trost
University
riding.
of Saskatchewan.
That's fair.
Although, looking at it, like I could see Brad Frost's fingerprints on. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if he had a hand crafting it.
And he doesn't get to run again because they primaried him out of his own seat. But his riding has put forward this motion to sort of recognize the validity of legislation to protect unborn children, which is this bill that the Conservative backbenchers have been putting forward every so many parliaments to just try to criminalize or like add an extra criminal offense of if you injure a pregnant woman, then you've also injured the fetus. And that's a way of sort of recognizing the fetus as a separate victim, as a way to say, therefore, the fetus is a legal person. And it's a few steps from there to criminalize abortion, but it is still a like...
Yeah, the more nuanced version of this, it generally falls into some version of we basically don't have any government regulation around it. More or less falls to the
Healthcare system.
to set it, and like the gap that was left between, I forget the court case off
Morgenthaler.
Yes, that one, and the eventually defeated conservative bill shortly thereafter has kind of left a bit of a void that, maybe we should look around to fill in. Like, that's the more nuanced version that you sometimes hear as well. This one reads a little less nuanced than that.
Yeah, and there's another motion a bit further down the order paper that might or might not make it, which would also repeal the Conservatives' promise not to legislate on abortion, which I think they only brought in a couple conventions ago when they did it here in Vancouver.
Yeah, it was a fairly recent one, and it does actually...
Or was that the same-sex marriage one?
Actually,
or maybe it was
that's
both.
probably the same-sex marriage one. The practical policy has not been to bring anything forward on that, although it's worth knowing this one's high enough. It's number 7 in its group, so good chance it makes it to the floor.
And I know some of the campaign life coalition groups are trying to organize people to go and support these motions, and I'm sure they'll be hotly debated, and it'll kind of be a signal of where the Conservative Party is going. Besides that, on social issues, they're also talking about adding a recognition of faith-based institutions to have a conscious rights. That is, religious hospitals can opt out of abortion and medical assistance in dying as policy. I mean, the Conservatives are kind of already saying that. They're talking a lot about free speech in this, but in sometimes it's more coded ways. I think the most
least subtle section.
The least subtle one is the compelled speech one that would repeal the addition of gender identity and expression to the Human Rights Code, because that forces people to utter made up pronouns like ze and zer, and it's just a poorly written.
It's
let
poorly
alone
written,
false.
doesn't actually understand the legislation that exists.
Yeah.
Oh, and that one's also bundled with defund universities.
Which was a Andrew Scheer
Yes.
platform plank on his leadership. So
Always a crowd pleaser.
it's like sometimes parties' policy manual proposals are too stereotypically them, and some of these definitely read as those are conservatives being very conservative. Reminds me why I'm not.
Well, it is a strange stand, this idea of compelled speech. It's just a misunderstanding of what actually is at stake. No one's going to jail. Well, it relates back to...
Well, Saudi Arabia tells us that Jordan Peterson is in jail.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson, in the substandard Canadian jails.
Of the University of Toronto.
Yeah, I know.
It is a pretty shitty school. It's not, though, but...
It's left coast politics here. It is playing to... there's a coming up from people... We don't know the history of exactly why that's there, but it's clear it's just trying to play to people's perceptions on where that debate has gone. And it has nothing to do with actually what's going on campuses and what's going on in classrooms. You talk to the vast majority of academics, and these are not... The way in which we talk about campuses have nothing to do with what actually... These controversies are pretty much ginned up. They're not reflecting the reality.
So yeah, just a couple of the ones I highlighted here that worth at least a quick shout out is right near the top, motions on both free trade of alcohol, so maybe finally getting some action on the Como front. And
Jesus. So there are a couple in here that I wholeheartedly support.
Yeah.
And
Labor
I'm fine with
mobility.
that. There was...
One on labor mobility,
and even
equalizing some of the regulations around interprovincial stuff was great.
Well, and even supporting veterans. There's a few things around there that it's just if we're going to have people, serving and giving their lives for the country, fucking support them when they get back so they're not committing suicide outside the Seaforth Armory, for fuck's sakes.
Yeah. So there's that.
Fair.
There's the one on meeting our 2% of GDP commitment on the military spend thing.
No, fuck that.
We should actually be doing it. We're underfunding our military. The equipment badly needs replacing. That's actually a reasonable one in there. How you pay for it's another question. No one really wants to take the hit on that. But
Just reduce our GDP. No, obviously.
that's the least popular solution to that conundrum.
Don't raise the spending or the...
Make us all poor so you don't have to spend as much on the military. But the one that really stood out to me as a what moment was the eliminate birthright citizenship. And I'm a little curious if this is the first time it's popped up in one of these proposals, but it really seems, I think it ties back into what we were talking about a little earlier with the questions around immigration bubbling up to the surface in the Conservative Party, because that's the sort of thing that I just can't even see like a Conservative Party under Harper even entertaining.
So to break this down, the motion specifically would say to get a Canadian citizenship, you can't just be born here, but your parents have at least one of your parents, I believe, would have to have a Canadian citizenship. So this is actually something a lot of countries do, but they also
most of the old world countries.
The European ones.
Yeah.
This is the birthright citizenship is the policy of Canada and the United States, and it is sort of a cornerstone of immigrant-based society. The idea you arrive here and you are creating a better life for your children. Being an immigrant, it sucks. It's not an easy task, no matter where you're coming from. And the idea is you're doing it for a better life for your family. That's why people undertake such a risky trip, risky move. And if the promise is thrown into abeyance that, well, you come here, well, maybe your kids will get in and maybe they won't. It depends on how things go for you. It just completely changes the equation. People aren't going to come here out of hope. They're going to come here out of desperation. It just changes the way in which the country looks to the world.
Well, and if you take this proposal, and there's another one in there about increasing the birth rate because of a fear of, a declining population, which we were talking before the pod about, like, there's both an actual discussion to be had there because a lot of Western countries do have declining birth rates, but there's also a very dog whistle way to have it. And I'll be charitable on this one and think that it's in the concerned way. But one of the good, at least I think, responses to a declining birth rate is to make sure we have a strong immigration system that makes sure we're bringing more people in, and killing birthright citizenship is not that.
I'm just reading this motion on increasing the birth rate. They do support income splitting for families, so that's nice.
You say as a family man.
Well, man, it just the key is to get the income to split. That's really the trick of income splitting. It's again, it's a different vision of what kind of country Canada is and how Canada built and what does it mean to be a member of this club of Canada and how do you get in? And it's changing. To get melodramatic about it, it's changing the terms of the social contract and who, specifically the boundaries, the borders of the social contract, who can become part of that agreement and what do you have to do in order to be part of that agreement. It's raising the fences. The figurative, not yet literal fences, is saying that from here on out we're going to not be open, we're going to protect what is already here. And it's a fundamentally different place to put the country in terms of where to build from here into the future.
Well, we'll have to see which of these proposals actually become Conservative policy in the next week. And
they have a big countdown on their website to the start of the convention, which will be kicking off basically around the time we record our live show. So we probably won't have follow-up for you on that, but nevertheless, you should come out to our live show because who knows what could happen in the next week, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss as the Conservative Party continues to be beset by drama.
I wonder if Bernier is going to live tweet it.
Moving on to Twit-tates, Finance Minister Bill Morneau has announced that he's ready to use, quote, emergency measures to protect our steel sector against the scourge of affordable steel. This is in response to a risk of cheap foreign steel imports. Basically, now that the U.S. is jacking up their tariffs, there's a concern that the steel that was going to be heading towards the U.S. might be heading towards Canada instead, adding more competition into our market and potentially lowering prices.
Better than that, though, is that his emergency measures is a 15-day public consultation.
It's an emergency consultation.
Yeah. We will suddenly talk to more people for 2 weeks.
It turns out trade is hard. And when your chief trading partner with whom substantial percentage of your total GDP is enmeshed suddenly changes the grounds on trade, things get complex and you want to do something. You don't really know what to do because there's not necessarily any good answers here.
Yeah, unfortunately the answers they do seem to have landed on is try and keep steel expensive, which doesn't seem like the greatest.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
Well, so the challenge here is balancing the interests of Canadian steel manufacturers and Canadian steel consumers. And everyone is happy when prices are kind of constant, or at least everyone is satisfied. Like maybe some people want prices to be higher so they make more money, others want them to be lower. But at least if your price is constant, you kind of can budget and, have a predictable business. When you're next to a flaming racist who just acts irrationally and randomly, who runs the world's biggest economy, you kind of have these random shitty things to respond to. And so he's thrown these tariffs up and it's thrown the whole market into chaos. And so now we have Canada invoking these emergency measures, which is a subset of one of the trade agreements we're in, for the first time in history. And it lets us basically bring in policies that would otherwise potentially, I guess, violate some of the trade agreements we've signed on to. Trump, I think, does precipitate emergencies, so I'm not going to criticize Morneau. I'm not going to criticize Morneau for this. I don't understand world trade enough to say whether this is the right or wrong call.
Well, so the problem is that when the U.S. increases tariffs, the price of steel goes up around the world, effectively. And that means that at the current rate, everybody was producing steel. There's more steel there than there is a market for. So you have essentially, imagine excess steel sloshing around the market. And so some of that is sloshing into Canada. And so now the question is, well, what do we do? There's not, again, this is where you have no ideal policy solution, and why free trade was nice back when we had that. Remember that? You have either to put your own tariffs on, which is what they're going to be looking at. So you put your own tariffs on this imported steel to protect your industry, because if you have cheap steel coming in from abroad being dumped into the Canadian industry, that's good for consumers, but it's not good for the industry that is used to that established price that you're talking about. Then you have to look at something like a tariff, and then of course tariffs are bad insofar as they raise prices for consumers. And so then it's not exactly through any fault of Canada's, but it's other than to not somehow negotiate a new treaty with the U.S., which turns out to be quite difficult these days. You still have to figure
It's almost like they don't want one.
Well, it's almost like they get a lot of rhetorical benefit out of taking runs at former close allies. But until that changes, then you're either going to accept cheap steel that threatens your domestic industry, or you're going to increase the tariff that's going to hurt your own consumers in roughly the same way that America's consumers are being hurt.
Do we want to shoot ourselves in the right foot or the left foot?
Basically. And there's no good answer to that question. It's just a question of what kind of damage do you prefer?
Well, one thing that steel is very vital in, and means will also get more expensive, is shipbuilding. And the Liberals are, I guess, reconsidering the approach they've been trying to take towards Navy shipbuilding, which has not been that successful.
Yeah, so, well, not just Navy shipbuilding, but shipbuilding in general for the Canadian government. So this also includes our Coast Guard, which we have 3 ships being built just a little north of here at the Seaspan shipyards. One of which, it just came out today, has a bunch of welding problems that have caused cracks in the welds, and they're going to have to basically redo them all.
Well, I was reading...
The welds, not the whole ship.
I was reading that issues in shipbuilding are very common, and so we should not be worried that our Coast Guard ships are falling apart before they're even in the sea.
It's more that they risk falling apart if put into the sea in their current state. Yeah, welds aren't great once you get cracks in them.
In fairness, they're microscopic. They're teeny tiny cracks. So
yeah, the problem is when they become big cracks.
I'm sure it's fine.
Welding tends to not do well with repeated stress. Anyway, a little too nerdy engineering for this, a politics podcast. But circling back to the national shipbuilding strategy, Ottawa hasn't officially said anything, but it's definitely making some noises internally and with the industry about maybe taking another look at it and tweaking the shipbuilding strategy a bit. And this was a program the Conservatives put in place, the Liberals inherited and more or less moved ahead with.
It's funny how messing up procurement has sort of become a bipartisan effort in Canada.
It's a Canadian tradition.
I mean, it does deserve.
It's like multiculturalism. We
so
can't.
You think with how bad we are at procurement, it would be easy to spend 2% of the GDP just with building the same ships over and over again. And yet,
that's all it takes to reach 2% GDP is just pissing away money. All right.
I mean, well, the thing is, if
Let's
you
at least get something for it.
if you're looking to fund a domestic shipbuilding industry, it's going to be expensive. And
they're paying jobs.
that's
I mean, there are people doing the same job over and over with
Right.
no product to show, but
yeah. I mean, it's like any other work creation. It doesn't quite cost as much as the sticker price, I suppose, because the money does come back into the economy. That's not the way we want to think about procurement. Ideally, you do still want to see a ship come out of the process at the end. And I mean, there's no easy way to fix Canada's procurement strategy. It's badly messed.
Yes, very badly. And it hasn't been without controversy. There's been some issues surrounding whether certain shipyards in Quebec were getting their fair shake, and some admirals got involved in it and ended up getting fired and investigated, and it's been a bit of a mess. So I can see why they want to reset. On the other hand, we're pretty far along in this, and it's going to throw things into even further disarray if we go with that. So, this will be one to watch.
we've moved from one Sophie's Choice to another where, on trade deals we're screwed and on shipbuilding we're screwed. And it sucks to be in government, I guess.
Yeah.
Despite how much everyone wants it.
But anyway, for another time.
Well, coming to us from one of my new must-listen Canadian law podcasts, of which there are now 2 on my list. Stereo Decisis.
100% increase.
Yeah, from the docket to the docket and Stereo Decisis. Although I haven't been listening to the docket because I haven't been watching The Staircase. So
yeah, I'm in the same spot right now.
last
on
few
a
episodes.
docket hiatus.
But Stereo Decisis, do check them out.
They're local.
Yeah. Well, 2/3 local.
2/3.
They
We're
recommended we talk about this story out of Andrew Weaver, who is again saying we should be like New Zealand and ban all the foreign buyers because that's clearly the problem in our housing market. And it's always weird when a story gets play when someone says the same thing they said 6 months ago or whatever. And I'm like, what is the news here?
Well, the news is New Zealand actually just went ahead with it this week. So that's why it's back in the news, is the thing New Zealand said it was going to do, they did. And now Andrew Weaver repeats himself, although not himself in the election, but like himself in the last 6 months.
So the basic premise is there's too much foreign capital coming into the market, too much demand side, essentially. So if we ban all of the foreign buyers, which on Andrew Weaver's argument was recognized by both this government and the last one, since they put in foreign buyers taxes. And so he's basically saying, if you recognize its problem, why not just ban it entirely? The counterpoint is that makes it really hard to immigrate, because if you're moving here and you want to buy a place to live, you can't do that. Now, maybe you can still rent or do something else, but I don't know. I can't really get behind this sort of absolutist proposal.
Yeah, it's needlessly punitive and, cuts off a lot of people who want to move here and it also kind of just plays into a bit of latent xenophobia that's happening around Vancouver and presumably New Zealand as well from some of the coverage I've seen there, which isn't great.
Yeah, so it does. There's this again really complex problem, right? What's driving up housing prices in Vancouver? Clearly, some percentage is related to foreign money. It's really hard to say what that percentage is. We have some research, and it seems like it's a growing portion of certain segments of the market, but it's clearly not all foreign money. It's not going to be solving that problem overnight. The fundamental issue here is there's a limited amount of supply, and there's a lot of capital just in Canada. Like a lot of the speculation comes from Canadian sources, so that you're not going to solve the problem simply by cutting off foreign money. And in doing that, you do cut off a lot of other possibilities, having people come to the country, different kinds of investment. It seems like it tries to solve what is a very multifaceted problem with a single, very blunt solution, which is not going to solve everything. So trying to address questions of supply along with some of the more onerous elements of demand, that seems like the best and indeed the only way that's ultimately going to work.
On those numbers, the stat that I've seen repeated in several different articles covering the New Zealand situation is 3%, which is ballpark kind of what the numbers we've seen here in BC has been. They tend to cluster in the single-digit percentage numbers. Some error bars on those, obviously, but like,
and some areas are a little bit higher, and some
condo
markets might be a little bit higher. And
if you slice the data finely, you can like find spots where it's higher, but like the overall number is a small minority of the overall market. So yeah, it does suggest that it's not the cause and might not even be a primary cause so much as a contributing factor. And it's really interesting to compare this to where the Greens were in the election, because they had probably the most balanced housing platform of any of the parties. And to see kind of Andrew Weaver shift to a much more rigid position on ban the foreigners is a little surprising.
Well, and I've given credit to the NDP for the housing plan they introduced in the budget this spring of 30 points, which talked about a bunch of efforts to build more housing. We talked with Patrick a few weeks ago about some of the moves they've made on student housing just to open up simple policies to let schools build the housing they want to build, and then on cracking down on some of that domestic and foreign speculation as well as going after people who feel they have a right to own two homes, which I'm not saying you don't, but if you do, you're kind of parking wealth in a way that disadvantages other people. So I still kind of laugh at the people who have their stupid anti-David Eby signs around this neighborhood because I can't sympathize. I can't empathize with those people.
Well, it's tough when the sign, I don't know. I think
it's
anybody who is in the neighborhood will see these signs, but it's often very hard to see the house behind the sign because the sign is often on a 20-foot
hedge
or actual literal wall, and you can't actually see the property behind it because it's so shrouded and protected from the riffraff. It's very hard to generate a lot of sympathy just from the placement of those signs.
Well,
yeah. So the Green Party platform is actually still online from the election. I'm surprised parties usually take those down, but
the NDP's is still up as well. I found the other day.
Yeah, sometimes they go down like the next day.
Yeah, so a little over a year ago, Andrew Weaver was wanting a 30% tax on foreign buyers.
Now he wants a
complete ban.
I was going to say 100%, but no, it's infinite.
Yes. You wonder, there could be different reasons for the change. One is if the problem seems to be worsening, or perhaps he's hearing more about it from his caucus, from supporters, then that's driving further action. It's an interesting problem specific to the Green Party, though, is that when they change their mind on something, they can move, if it's not an environmental issue, they can move very far because they don't have a single sort of part of the... See, I told you we were going to talk about axes, the left-right spectrum. They tend to live somewhere in the center-left, sometimes the center-right, and they move around, and they are what I sometimes call a question party. They're absolutely sure what the question is. How do we protect the environment? That's their reason for being. But on the answers, they can vary quite a bit. So they aren't going to be held down to a certain sort of subset of answers. Like the NDP has a certain subset of answers. When they are in government, they tend to be a little more pragmatic than when they're out of government. Ditto for the NDP or the Liberals or the Conservatives. When they're in government, they're a little more pragmatic. When they're out of office, they're a little more doctrinaire. But the Green Party, they have more room to drift. And that is both a blessing and a curse.
I'd argue the Liberal Party is a question party, the question being, how do we stay in power?
Well, that's not an unfair question to ask, given they do like to think of themselves as the natural ruling party. So if that's your motto, then that's your question.
Well, speaking of housing, and you were mentioning the mansions around here, one of the other things that has come up is Richmond has tried to pass some bylaws to almost, I guess, allow mega mansions on some of the ALR farmland, and now they're not happy that the province is kind of not allowing them to do that.
Yeah, so they kind of relaxed some of the zoning rules around their agriculturally zoned land, I believe, to, I think it was allow up to 10,000 some odd square feet of housing to be built.
So do they have a name? They're not McMansions, they're farm mansions?
Farm mansions is what I've generally heard
Okay.
the term be.
Yeah, farm
Barns?
mega mansions.
Barns. Livable barns. Anyways, carry on.
The provincial government's basically taken a notice of that and said, no, we actually think that should be about half that is what you should be allowed to build. And Minister Lana Popham's getting ready to overrule the Richmond City Council on this one.
Well, and this touches on two stories we talked about last week. First, the commission that was studying the agricultural land reserve and how do we protect the farmland that we have in this province. And the other is just how cities have no power in reality, and they're all just creatures of provincial governments. And so if the provincial government says the city is acting wrongly, it's not actually that hard for it to just overrule them and fix the problem, as it were.
They tend to be a little reluctant to do it, although I'll take probably a somewhat unpopular opinion and say they don't do it enough when it comes to really bad land use policies.
I think it's an issue of blame. It's always easier to let someone else, even if it's a bad policy, let them make a bad policy and own it, rather than fix it and, risk fixing it worse.
Oh, yeah. You definitely saw that with the Christy Clark government, who was very clear that this was a problem that municipal politicians weren't doing their job when it came to zoning and supply, but she had absolutely no interest in having the province do anything to fix that.
There's a sort of institutional design question here, too. There's an argument to be made that if you were making a decision, the decision should sort of be made the closest level to those affected possible. So, sort of an argument for federalism. If Canada was just a unitary country, as actually one columnist just suggested.
Scott Gilmore.
Yeah, crazily enough.
He, like, every other column is just, what? Anyway, that's another. We'll link it in the show notes. You can read it and scratch your head like we did.
Well, I sometimes challenge my students with this. What would Canada be better off as a unitary state? And the answer, you can come up with arguments. I make them come up with arguments of for and against. But the cost, the major cost, is that all the decisions are taken, unless you actually live in Ottawa, they're taken very far away. It's a big country, and the interests change dramatically from one end to the other. And so putting decisions closer to where the people are actually affected, there's a strong theoretical and to some extent an empirical justification for it. Where it breaks down, though, is if that local process is somehow imperfect or problematic or some way. So those who are actually making the decisions, if they're not all who are actually affected by the decision, then that's a problem. So in a case of zoning that is benefiting those looking to build farm mansions and not necessarily taking into account others who want to use the land, then that's not a good decision process.
Yeah, and I normally am fairly sympathetic to the first view you put forward, but yeah, I think the practical experience is that land use has a hyper-localism problem to it, and there's a lot of spillover effects that municipalities and neighborhoods don't account for in their current decision-making, and actually really like the Japanese model for that reason is because it's basically brought up to the national level, and obviously that we wouldn't want to open the Constitution to do that here, but the province having a bigger role in it is something I think would be worth considering, although it's very unlikely to happen.
So the agricultural land reserve, which is kind of unique in Canada in that it's a provincial policy that applies to not all of the farmland in the province, but a significant chunk in every corner, is so successful and has withstood government, like it was introduced by an openly socialist government of Dave Barrett, but survived very different parties sort of coming in, and has kind of grown more popular just because BC's geography means we only have so much farmland, and we all kind of get that we need food. And the idea that, sort of like you're talking about this, Stewart, this idea that you need to tie those decisions to where they're affected. Well, we only have so much farmland, and so to make sure we feed everyone in the province, and obviously we get a lot of food from out of province, but on a very minimal level, or first order, ruining that food land in Richmond means people in Vernon might not be eating.
Right.
It's obviously doesn't mean that, but we do recognize the importance of food security as a province, and recognized it early, and therefore that decision by the Richmond Council to permit bigger houses that don't necessarily respect the purpose of that land has knock-on effects to other communities who don't have a direct say. And so that's where I think the balancing comes in as a way to say the province has said, we need this land so we have food.
I mean, it sort of reminds me of that saying in a different context, right? An explanation should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So the level should be as local as possible, but no more local. You want to have all who are affected by a decision involved in the decision. So, just like you're saying, the decision over land use on the edge of Richmond has repercussions that go far beyond the edge of Richmond. So the province is, in this case, arguably better positioned to consider that all affected stake and is to move the decision and to leave it in the hands of a municipal government that is very focused on a subset of issues and doesn't really have the totality in mind. That's might be a mistake. So that's one way to justify it, right? And that's one way to think about saying the government probably is right here to step in and correct what, from an outsider's perspective, is probably not a good decision to allow more and more farmland to be eaten up in these farmland.
At the same time, I still support giving cities some constitutional power so that they're not as, at the whim of provinces, because we've seen in Ontario the risks of that. But that's a much bigger debate that is well outside the remit of a quick take of an episode that's going long already.
Yeah, Scott Gilmore wants to open up the Constitution to get rid of provinces. You want to add more city provinces?
City-states.
City-state
Well, at least-
provinces?
No.
Maybe grant them their own constitutional status.
I think there's a really important discussion happening here, which should be its own podcast. I mean, own episode. Hey, it could be an entire podcast on it. There's a lot to talk about here. Like, what is the role of cities and big cities versus small cities? Do we have to treat them all the same? There's so many issues here, and the Doug Ford move in Toronto sort of brought that into focus again. This is a very small version of a related problem, but from a different angle. So we could absolutely, as a country, have a national or even set of national or sub-national conversations about what do we want, where do we want our cities to be in our politics, and do they need more prominence? What do they need to get the job done?
And finally, the Green Party has confirmed that they won't be running a candidate in Burnaby South against Jagmeet Singh. This was rumored. I think we actually mentioned it briefly last time, but nobody confirmed it, so we added a big rumor tag to it, essentially. But now it's been confirmed. I mean, I guess the Greens have had enough issues in the past trying to get leaders elected. They can sympathize and aren't going to do it here.
I can see both sides of this from their perspective. Like, on the one hand, the Greens are trying to portray themselves as a national party, and to be that, you need to run everywhere seriously. There's also this convention in Canadian politics that we talked about with David Moscrop last week about parties not running against the leaders of other parties, except for the NDP, who doesn't give a shit about that, because democracy means giving people a choice and an alternative. Always make sure there's a mouse to run against the cats. But here you have the Greens looking like they're trying to respect that tradition, which, I don't know. Maybe they also just don't have the resources. They don't seem to have ever done particularly well in Burnaby South. I think they got below 3% in the last election. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. But it's also kind of, ground zero for the pipeline debate, which the Greens are all in on. And so you think they would be there at least to get some profile.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting whether they think, part of this equation is going to be how Singh positions himself. If he's running in Burnaby South, presumably the heir to Kennedy Stewart, who took a very strong line against pipelines, they're going to have to honor that tradition, and so that's going to possibly even shift the NDP as a whole, at least at the federal level, in a more environmentally climate change focused direction, which I don't know if that's... It depends how Elizabeth May and the Greens see their role in Canada. If their role is to move discussion, then that's to the good. If their role is to get people elected, that's not actually doing themselves any favors. To have an NDP that is strongly pro-environmental emanating. So it's hard to have a leader who is taking a strong environmental stance in Burnaby South, and to have the party in other parts of the country widely diverge from that. So there are wheels within wheels here, and it's not clear exactly why the Green Party are doing that.
Singh has taken some strong anti-Trans Mountain positions in the last, or made them more vocal in the last couple of weeks. I think he first staked out that territory towards the end of the leadership debate, and then kind of was quiet about it for a while, and then it picked back up. And just in the last week or so, he's had some spats with Rachel Notley over it, where one of them made some comments about the other, and then I think he walked back a little bit, but still said, I'm not for this pipeline. And so he's trying to pick up that mantle of Kennedy Stewart's, and, running in Burnaby, he's got kind of if he doesn't do that, what's his path in? But he's also talking about pharmacare and some other big NDP promises. But yeah, the Greens not running means probably not much given their lack of presence in that riding.
Yeah, and it might be...
Still be a Liberal NDP race.
Yeah, it may be, honestly, they just wanted to try to win a bit of friendship from the NDP. Maybe they tactical decision, they just don't have the resources to spare. So it could be any one of these things or a combination, and we don't know for sure. But I think the implications for the NDP and how they position themselves for the upcoming federal will be possibly quite significant.
Well, before we close off for the night, Stewart, why don't you tell our listeners, I guess, both what you do, just we didn't do that at the start of the episode, and where they can find you.
I just assume all our listeners listen to my other podcast because I'm biased like that, and if you're not, you should be. Canby Report's really taking off. I'm doing 2 live shows next week for you people.
You're going to be exhausted by the end of that.
Oh yeah, and I'm camping both weekends before and after, so August is just going to be a blur. Anyway, who are you?
So, who am I? I am a Vancouver-based political scientist. I teach in a number of different places. This coming semester, I'll be teaching at Douglas and Simon Fraser University. I am trained in international relations and comparative politics, so I warmed up to the tariff discussion there for that reason. I most often find myself teaching Canadian politics these days, which I also quite enjoy talking and tweeting about. So easiest way to find me and to talk to me and interact is on Twitter at my name, Stewart Prest, Stewart Prest. And yeah, I'm reasonably active on Twitter, and I enjoy respectful discussion, and that's it in a nutshell.
Remember to check out our live show coming up on Thursday. It's the 100th episode, which is still incredible to get to. Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/politicoast, because Canby Report's just gotten a bunch of new patrons and has beaten us in
that's simply unacceptable.
dollar amounts. And come on, just like $2 a month, we'll figure out some things to give you, dear listeners who have kept this going, who have bought us most of these mics that have made Canby Report successful. Like, this is the original podcast.
This is the OG.
Yeah. So show us your support and come out to our live show next week.
Yes, please do. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe to our listen podcast and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.